Clara Sutton's fingers were still bleeding when she pulled her son from the wreckage. 7-year-old Eli wasn't crying. He hadn't cried since the flood took everything: their home, their livestock, their last hope of surviving winter. She pressed him against her chest, feeling his small heart racing like a trapped bird, and whispered the only lie she had left. "We'll be all right, baby. Mama's gonna fix this." But as she looked at the ruins of 3 years' work scattered across the Texas mud, Clara knew the truth. She had nothing left to fix anything with. If you want to see how one silent cowboy changed everything for this broken family, subscribe to our channel and watch until the end. Drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. I love seeing how far Clara's story travels. The November wind cut through Mesquite Springs like a razor, but Clara Sutton barely felt it. Her hands were too busy digging. "Eli, stay back." The boy didn't move. He stood exactly where she'd put him, mud caking his thin legs up to the knees, his good ear turned toward her like he was trying to catch every sound she made. His other ear, the one damaged in the train robbery 2 years ago, faced the ruins of what used to be their home. Clara's fingers found something solid beneath the debris. She pulled hard, and her mother's medicine chest emerged from the mud, its brass hinges twisted but intact. Inside, her nursing supplies were soaked but salvageable. Bandages, carbolic acid, the forceps she'd used to deliver half the babies in 3 counties. "Thank God," she whispered. "Mama." Clara's head snapped up. Eli was pointing toward the ridge. A man sat on horseback watching them. Even from this distance, Clara recognized the silhouette, broad shoulders, straight posture, the kind of stillness that came from years of reading danger in open country. Jacob Callahan, the richest rancher in Mesquite Springs, the man who'd partnered with her dead husband in the Texas Rangers before Thomas got himself killed chasing train robbers, the man who hadn't spoken to her once in 2 years. Clara turned her back on him and kept digging. The flood had come 3 days ago, but the town's response had come faster. Pastor Williams had delivered the verdict yesterday, standing on the steps of Mesquite Springs' only church, with his Bible clutched like a weapon. "The Lord tests those he loves," he'd said, his eyes sliding past Clara like she was already a ghost. But some trials are warnings. Some women carry darkness with them. Clara had stood in the back, Eli's hand gripping hers so tight she could feel his bones. She'd watched the congregation nod, watched Mrs. Henderson from the general store whisper to her neighbor, watched the blacksmith, the same blacksmith whose wife Clara had saved from childbed fever, look away when she met his eyes. Cursed woman. Bad luck widow. The whispers had followed her since Thomas died. Now they'd finally won. "Mama, he's coming." Clara didn't look up. Her hands found Eli's drawing tablet miraculously dry beneath a fallen beam, and she set it aside with the medicine chest. 2 possessions saved from a lifetime of building. Hoofbeats approached. Stopped. "Mrs. Sutton." His voice was deeper than she remembered. Rougher, like he'd spent the last 2 years swallowing words instead of speaking them. "Mr. Callahan, you need help." Clara stood slowly, wiping her bloody hands on her ruined dress. Jacob Callahan sat astride a black stallion that probably cost more than her entire homestead had been worth. His face was weathered by 40-odd years of Texas sun, and his eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray and hard, and impossible to read. "I need a lot of things," Clara said. "Help ain't one of them. You'll freeze tonight." "Then I'll freeze." Jacob's jaw tightened. "The boy, too." The words hit Clara like a slap. She looked at Eli, really looked at him for the first time since the flood. His lips were pale. His small frame shook beneath the torn blanket she'd wrapped around his shoulders. His eyes, Thomas's eyes, watched her with a trust she didn't deserve. "What do you want, Mr. Callahan? I want you to stop being a fool." Clara's hands curled into fists. "Excuse me." Jacob dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the mud with a sound like a judge's gavel. He walked past her without waiting for permission and began sorting through the debris with the efficiency of a man who'd done this before. "Your foundation's gone," he said, not looking at her. "Timbers are rotted through flood, just finished what time started. You rebuild here, you'll be doing it again next spring." "I didn't ask for your assessment." "No, you asked to freeze to death with your 7-year-old son." Jacob pulled a waterlogged trunk from the rubble, set it aside. "Pride's a luxury, Mrs. Sutton. Staying alive ain't." Clara wanted to scream at him, wanted to tell him exactly where he could put his opinions and his charity and his sudden interest in her welfare after 2 years of silence. But Eli coughed. It was a wet sound deep in his chest, the kind of cough that had killed 3 children in Mesquite Springs last winter. Clara was at his side before the sound finished echoing, her hand on his forehead, her nurse's instincts overriding everything else. Warm. Too warm. "How long?" Jacob asked. He was beside her, suddenly close enough that she could smell leather and horses, and something else, wood smoke maybe, or just the particular scent of a man who worked for a living despite his wealth. "He was fine this morning." "He wasn't fine this morning. You just didn't want to see it." Clara's head snapped up, fury building in her chest, but Jacob was already lifting Eli into his arms, handling the boy with surprising gentleness for a man his size. "Put him down." "No, Mr. Callahan." "My barn's warm." Jacob was already walking toward his horse. "Got a stove, blankets, clean hay. Boy needs to be dry and warm before that cough turns into something worse." "I said put him down." Jacob stopped, turned. His gray eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Your husband saved my life 3 times in the Rangers, Mrs. Sutton. Made me promise if anything happened to him, I'd watch over his family." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "I've been keeping that promise from a distance for 2 years because you made it clear you didn't want help. But I ain't watching his son die of pneumonia because you're too proud to accept a roof." Clara stood frozen, the wind cutting through her wet clothes, her bloody hands shaking at her sides. Thomas had never mentioned a promise. Never mentioned Jacob Callahan at all, except in passing, a partner from his Ranger days, nothing more. "Why didn't you?" she started. "One night," Jacob interrupted. "That's all I'm asking. Get the boy warm, get him fed, figure out your next move in the morning." He paused. "You can hate me just as well from a dry barn as a mud pile." Eli coughed again, and Clara felt something break inside her chest. One night. Jacob's ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of Texas hill country, but the main house sat dark and empty as they approached. Clara counted 6 windows, all of them black. A house built for a family occupied by a ghost. The barn, though the barn glowed with lamplight. "You were ready," Clara said, as Jacob helped her down from the wagon he'd had waiting on the ridge. "You had the wagon loaded before the flood even hit." Jacob lifted Eli from the wagon bed, the boy's small body limp with exhaustion against his broad chest. "I've been ready for 2 years." "Why?" He didn't answer, just carried Eli into the barn and laid him on a bed of clean hay that had clearly been prepared in advance. Blankets were already stacked nearby. A pot of something that smelled like beef stew sat warming on the cast-iron stove. Clara watched him work, stoking the fire, arranging blankets around Eli, pouring water into a tin cup, and felt the foundations of her understanding shift beneath her. "You've been watching us." "Yes." "All this time? The day I couldn't afford feed, and somehow a sack appeared at my door?" "Yes." "The medicine for Eli's ear when Dr. Patterson refused to treat us?" "Yes." Clara sank onto a hay bale, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. 2 years. 2 years of mysterious help, appearing exactly when she needed it, and she'd never once suspected the silent rancher who'd avoided her at every social function and church service. "I thought you blamed me," she whispered. "For Thomas." Jacob's hands stilled on the blanket he was tucking around Eli. "Blamed you. Everyone else does. Said I should have stopped him from going after those train robbers. Said a good wife would have..." Those people are fools. The words came out hard-edged with an anger Clara hadn't expected. Jacob straightened slowly, his back to her, and she saw his shoulders rise and fall with a breath that seemed to cost him something. Thomas didn't die because of you, Mrs. Sutton. He died because I wasn't fast enough to save him. Jacob turned, and Clara saw something in his gray eyes that looked like a wound that had never healed. I was his partner. I was supposed to have his back, and I failed. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy as the smell of wood smoke and hay. That's why you've been watching. That's part of it. What's the other part? Jacob looked at Eli sleeping. Now his breathing still rough, but steadier than it had been. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because he made me promise. Last thing he said before he died while I was trying to stop the bleeding. Jacob's voice cracked. He said, "Take care of Clara and the boy Jake. Promise me." And I promised. Clara felt tears building behind her eyes, hot and unexpected. She hadn't cried when she'd learned about Thomas's death, hadn't cried at the funeral, or during the long months afterward when the town turned against her. She'd been too busy surviving to waste time on tears. But now, in this warm barn surrounded by evidence of a promise kept in silence for 2 years, she felt the wall inside her chest beginning to crack. Why didn't you tell me? Would you have let me help? The question needed no answer. They both knew what Clara's pride would have demanded. I don't understand, she said finally. You could have just sent money. Hired someone to check on us. You're Jacob Callahan. You could have done this from a distance without anyone knowing. I tried that. First 6 months I just had my foreman deliver supplies when you weren't looking. Jacob moved to the stove, poured coffee into a tin cup, handed it to her. But then there was the drought, and then the townspeople started treating you like a plague carrier. And then, he stopped. Then what? Jacob was quiet for a long moment. Then I started caring about more than just the promise. Clara didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know what to do with the information that this silent, wealthy rancher had spent 2 years watching over her family from the shadows, not just out of obligation to a dead friend, but because somewhere along the way, watching had turned into something else. Mr. Callahan. Jake. He settled onto a hay bale across from her, close enough to talk, but not close enough to presume. Been 2 years. I think we're past formalities. Jake, then. Clara wrapped her hands around the warm coffee cup, let the heat seep into her frozen fingers. I appreciate what you've done, truly. But tomorrow morning, Eli and I need to find somewhere else. Why? Because people already talk about me. A widow staying in a single man's barn. Clara shook her head. I can't give them more ammunition. Let them talk. Easy for you to say. You're Jacob Callahan. You own half the county. I'm Clara Sutton, the cursed widow who killed her husband by not being woman enough to keep him home. Jake's expression hardened. Anyone who says that in my hearing will regret it. That's not... Clara sighed. I can't fight the whole town, Jake. I've been trying for 2 years and I'm tired. So tired. Then stop fighting alone. The words were simple, but something in his tone made Clara look up. Jake was watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, not with fear, but with something she hadn't felt since Thomas died. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting you stop seeing help as weakness. I'm suggesting you let me rebuild your cabin properly, this time stone foundation, solid timber, the kind of construction that'll last 50 years. Jake leaned forward. And I'm suggesting we do it together as partners, so nobody can say you took charity. Partners. You know nursing. You've got skills half the doctors in Texas would envy. My men get hurt regular breaks, cuts worse. Having someone on the ranch who could tend to them would be worth more than money. It was a face-saving fiction, Clara realized. A way to frame charity as exchange, to let her keep her pride while accepting what she needed. It was clever. It was kind. It was exactly what Thomas would have done. You're very like him, she said softly. Thomas. He always found ways to help people without making them feel small. Jake's expression flickered with something that might have been pain. We rode together for 5 years. Some things rub off. He never told me much about his ranger days, just said he had a partner he trusted with his life. That goes both ways, Mrs. Jake caught himself. Clara. Her name in his mouth felt strange, intimate somehow in a way that his hands on her shoulders or his arms around Eli hadn't been. A name was a choice, an invitation. Clara, she agreed. Eli stirred in his sleep, mumbling something unintelligible. Clara moved to his side, immediately touching his forehead, checking his breathing. The fever was still there, but no worse than before. The warmth and dry clothes were doing their work. He looks like Thomas, Jake said quietly. Around the eyes. Everyone says that. Does he have his father's stubbornness too? Clara almost smiled. Worse, and he got my temper on top of it. Lord help us all. It was such an unexpected response, dry humor from a man she'd thought had none, that Clara actually laughed. The sound surprised her, rusty and strange after so long without use. Jake smiled, just slightly, barely visible in the lamplight. It transformed his weathered face, made him look younger, less burdened by whatever weights he carried. You should do that more often, he said. Laugh. Be something other than a fortress. Jake stood, moved toward the barn door. I'll be in the house if you need anything. Don't open this door after dark. We've had wolves coming down from the hills since the cold snap. Jake. He stopped, hand on the door frame. Thank you, Clara said, for everything you've done, for 2 years of watching and worrying and never asking for anything in return. Jake was silent for a long moment. Don't thank me yet, Clara. Tomorrow's gonna bring trouble, and I reckon it's the kind that's been building for a while. What do you mean? But he was already gone, disappearing into the darkness between the barn and the house, leaving Clara alone with her sleeping son, and the growing certainty that Jacob Callahan knew things about her situation that he hadn't yet revealed. She should have slept. Eli was warm, the barn was safe, and exhaustion pulled at her bones like lead weights. But Clara's mind wouldn't quiet. She kept replaying the day, the flood's aftermath, the town's rejection. Jake's sudden appearance with a wagon already loaded. 2 years of silent watching. 2 years of secret help. And underneath it all, the question that wouldn't stop nagging at her. Why now? Why reveal himself now after so long in the shadows? The answer came to her slowly, pieced together from fragments she hadn't connected before. The letter from the railroad company last month, offering to buy her land at 1/4 its value. The sudden increase in her general store prices. The way Vernon Blackwood, the town's wealthiest citizen, after Jake had started attending church services again, after years of absence, always positioning himself where he could watch her. Someone was trying to drive her out. And the flood hadn't been the start of it, just the final blow. Clara looked at her sleeping son, at the peaceful expression on his face that made him look so much like Thomas, and felt something cold settle in her chest. Whatever was coming, whatever trouble Jake had hinted at, she would face it. She had lost her home, lost her reputation, lost nearly everything that made survival possible in this unforgiving country. But she still had Eli. She still had her skills. And now, impossibly, she might have an ally. Clara laid down beside her son, pulled the blankets close, and let herself believe just for tonight that tomorrow might bring something other than more destruction. Outside, the wind howled across the Texas hills, carrying with it the scent of change and the promise of storms yet to come. Morning came with the sound of hoofbeats. Clara was on her feet before her eyes fully opened, her hand reaching instinctively for Eli. The boy stirred, but didn't wake, his fever broken sometime in the night, his breathing finally clear and easy. 3 horses, maybe 4, coming fast from the direction of town. Clara moved to the barn door and cracked it open just enough to see. Jake was already crossing the yard from the main house, his hand resting on the Colt revolver at his hip. His posture told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't a friendly visit. The lead rider was Vernon Blackwood. Clara had seen him perhaps a dozen times in the 2 years since Thomas died, always from a distance, always watching her with eyes that calculated rather than observed. He was a handsome man in his 50s, silver-haired and impeccably dressed even on horseback, the kind of man who made wealth look like a natural extension of his person. Behind him rode Wade Garrett, the town's only lawyer, and 2 men Clara didn't recognize. Deputies maybe, or hired muscle-dressed to look official. "Callahan." Blackwood's voice carried across the yard with the easy authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Heard you had company last night." News travels fast. In a town this size, always. Blackwood dismounted with practiced grace, handing his reins to one of the unknown men. "Mrs. Sutton, my condolences on your misfortune." Clara stepped out of the barn, pulling the door closed behind her to shield Eli from view. "Mr. Blackwood?" "Terrible thing losing a home. Terrible thing." Blackwood shook his head with what might have been genuine sympathy if his eyes hadn't remained so cold. "I wanted to come personally to extend an offer of assistance." "That's generous of you." "Not generous at all, simply practical." Blackwood reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "I've been meaning to speak with you about your property for some time. Given recent events, it seems the conversation has become rather urgent." Jake moved closer, positioning himself between Clara and Blackwood without appearing to do so deliberately. "What kind of conversation?" "A business one, Callahan. Nothing that concerns you." "Mrs. Sutton is staying on my property. That makes it my concern." Something flickered in Blackwood's eyes. Annoyance, maybe, or something colder. "I wasn't aware you'd taken such personal interest in the widow's welfare." "Now you are." The tension between the 2 men crackled like heat lightning. Clara watched them measure each other, 2 predators recognizing a threat, and felt the ground beneath her feet shift in ways she didn't fully understand. "Mrs. Sutton," Blackwood said, his attention returning to her with visible effort. "I'm prepared to offer you $800 for your homestead. Cash today, no complications." $800. It was a fortune for a widow with nothing. It was also less than a quarter of what the land was worth. "That's very kind," Clara said carefully. "But I'm not interested in selling." Blackwood's smile didn't waver. "Perhaps you misunderstand your situation. Your home is destroyed. Your credit in town is, shall we say, limited. Winter is coming and you have a young son to consider." He paused, let the words sink in. $800 could take you somewhere warm. California, perhaps. Somewhere you could start fresh without the unfortunate reputation that seems to follow you here. "My reputation." "People talk, Mrs. Sutton. Surely you've noticed." Blackwood's voice dripped with false sympathy. "Some women carry bad luck with them. It's not fair, of course, but it's reality. A fresh start might be exactly what you and your boy need." Clara felt anger building in her chest, hot and familiar. "What I need, Mr. Blackwood, is for people to mind their own business." "Clara." Jake's voice was quiet warning, but Clara was past warnings. 2 years of whispers and turned backs and slow strangulation had built a pressure inside her that demanded release. "You want my land," she said flatly. "Why?" Blackwood's smile finally faltered. "I don't know what you mean." $800 for 40 acres of scrub and a destroyed cabin. Nobody pays that kind of money for charity, Mr. Blackwood. So what do you actually want? The silence stretched between them like a held breath. "Perhaps we should discuss this another time," Blackwood said finally. "When you're less emotional." "I'm not emotional. I'm asking a direct question." "And I've given you a generous offer." Blackwood's voice had lost its warmth. "I suggest you consider it carefully. Opportunities like this don't come twice." He remounted his horse with the same practiced grace he'd shown dismounting, but Clara caught something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Frustration. Maybe even anger. "Callahan," Blackwood said, settling into his saddle. "A word of advice. Be careful whose battles you choose to fight. Some wars aren't worth winning." "I'll keep that in mind." Blackwood nodded once, a sharp gesture that managed to convey both dismissal and threat, and turned his horse toward town. His men followed, leaving Clara and Jake standing in the morning chill with the weight of unspoken conflict heavy between them. "That wasn't smart," Jake said quietly. "Probably not. You made an enemy just now." Clara watched Blackwood's retreating form until it disappeared over the ridge. "I think I already had one. I just didn't know his name." Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to face her fully, his gray eyes serious in a way that made her stomach tighten. "There's something you need to know. Something I should have told you last night." "What?" "Your husband didn't die chasing train robbers." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. "What are you talking about?" "The official story bandits shoot out Thomas caught in the crossfire. It's not true." Jake's voice was rough-pained. "Thomas was investigating something. Someone. He'd found evidence of land fraud, water rights manipulation, people being driven off their property through intimidation and legal tricks." Clara's mind raced, trying to connect pieces that had never fit together properly. Land fraud. The railroads coming through this region in the next few years. Whoever controls the water rights controls everything cattle farming development. Thomas figured out that someone was systematically acquiring property along the proposed route using forged documents and manufactured debts. And this someone killed him. Jake's jaw tightened. "I can't prove it. But the timing was too convenient. Thomas was getting close to naming names, and then suddenly he's dead in what looked like a random robbery." Clara felt the world tilting beneath her feet. For 2 years, she'd accepted the official story. Random violence. Wrong place, wrong time. The kind of senseless tragedy that the frontier produced with terrible regularity. But this was something else entirely. "Blackwood," she whispered. "I don't know, not for certain." Jake ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration that seemed uncharacteristic for such a controlled man. "Thomas never told me who he suspected. Said it was safer if I didn't know in case something happened to him." "But you think it's Blackwood?" "I think Vernon Blackwood has acquired more property in the last 3 years than anyone else in the territory. I think he has connections to the railroad surveyors. And I think your 40 acres sits right on top of the best water source in 20 miles. Clara thought about the letter from the railroad company. The sudden increase in her store prices. The flood that had destroyed her home so conveniently, leaving her desperate enough to consider any offer. "He's been planning this," she said slowly. "For how long?" "Since before Thomas died, I reckon. Your husband was the only one who'd figured out what was happening. With him gone, and you discredited as a cursed widow. No one would believe me if I tried to expose him. No one would even listen." Clara turned away, pressing her hands against her face, as the full scope of what she was facing became clear. This wasn't just about her land. This was about her husband's murder. About a conspiracy that had been building for years. About a man powerful enough to kill a Texas Ranger and make it look like an accident. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I couldn't prove anything. Because you'd already lost so much." Jake's voice was gentle but honest. "Because I thought if I just watched over you, kept you safe eventually, I'd find the evidence Thomas couldn't." "And did you?" "Some. Not enough." Jake moved closer, lowered his voice. "But Blackwood just made a mistake. Coming here making that offer in front of witnesses, he's getting impatient. The railroad survey team is due next month. Whatever he's planning, he needs your land before they arrive." Clara turned to face him. "So what do we do?" "We don't do anything. You take Eli somewhere safe, and I handle Blackwood." "No." The word came out harder than Clara intended, sharp enough to make Jake's eyebrows rise. "This is about my husband," she said. "My land. My family. I'm not running away while you fight my battles." Clara: "You said Thomas made you promise to protect us, but he also spent his life fighting for what was right. What would he want me to do? Hide, run? Let the man who killed him win." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face for something Clara couldn't name. "He'd want you to survive," he said finally. "Then help me survive and fight. Don't ask me to choose." The barn door creaked open behind them, and Eli appeared in the gap, his small face still pale, but his eyes alert. He looked from Clara to Jake, and back again, then held up his drawing tablet. The picture showed 3 figures, a woman, a boy, and a tall man standing together in front of a house. Around them, smaller figures lay fallen on the ground, clearly defeated. "Smart boy," Jake murmured. "He understands more than people think." Eli walked to Jake and tugged on his sleeve until the rancher bent down to his level. Then, with the solemnity of a judge passing sentence, the boy pointed at the tall figure in the drawing and said his first full sentence in 2 years. "You're gonna help Mama win." It wasn't a question. Jake looked at Clara over Eli's head, and something passed between them, an understanding, a commitment, a shared recognition that they had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Yeah?" Jake said quietly. "I reckon I am." The morning after Blackwood's visit brought a different kind of trouble. Maria Santos arrived at the ranch just past dawn, her horse lathered from hard riding. Her dark eyes wild with fear. She was Clara's age, Mexican by birth, widowed in the same train robbery that had killed Thomas and damaged Eli's hearing. "Clara." Maria was off her horse before it fully stopped grabbing Clara's hands with desperate strength. "You have to listen. There's something I should have told you 2 years ago." Maria, slow down. "What's wrong?" "The robbery. The one that killed Thomas and Miguel." Maria's voice cracked on her husband's name. "It wasn't random. I found letters, Miguel's letters. He was helping your husband investigate something, and he wrote everything down." Clara felt Jake move closer behind her, his presence solid and reassuring. "What kind of letters? Names, dates, land transactions that didn't make sense." Maria pulled a bundle of papers from her saddlebag, her hands shaking. "I didn't understand what I was reading at first, didn't want to understand. But after what happened to your home, after Blackwood started asking questions about my property too. Blackwood approached you, yesterday, offered me $500 for my 10 acres. Maria laughed bitterly. 10 acres of rock and mesquite that wouldn't support a single cow. Why would anyone pay that much? "Water," Jake said quietly. Both women turned to look at him. "Your land borders Clara's on the east side. Together they control access to Willow Creek's headwaters." Jake's expression was grim. Blackwood needs both properties to complete his water rights scheme. Maria pressed the letters into Clara's hands. "These prove it. Miguel documented everything, the forged signatures, the bribed officials, the threats against families who wouldn't sell. He was going to take it to the territorial marshal, but then the robbery happened." "It wasn't a robbery." Maria's voice dropped to a whisper. "Miguel's letters name the men who attacked the train. They weren't bandits, Clara. They were hired. And the man who hired them—" "Don't." Jake stepped forward, his hand raised in warning. "Don't say that name out loud. Not here. Not now." Maria's mouth snapped shut, but her eyes said everything her voice couldn't. Clara looked down at the letters in her hands. 2 years of grief. 2 years of struggling alone. 2 years of being treated like a curse. And the truth had been hiding in a dead man's papers the whole time. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice barely steady. "I was afraid." Maria's eyes filled with tears. "I saw what happened to your husband for asking questions. I saw what happened to you for being connected to him. I thought if I just kept quiet, kept my head down, I'd be safe. And now Blackwood's coming for my land too. Now I realize there's no safety in silence." Maria gripped Clara's arm. "We have to fight him, Clara, together. It's the only way either of us survives." Jake took the letters from Clara's hands and began reading them with the focused intensity of a man who'd spent years waiting for exactly this kind of evidence. "This is good," he said after several minutes. "Not enough to hang Blackwood, but enough to start an official investigation." "Then we take it to the marshal," Clara said. "The territorial marshal is 300 miles away. By the time we got there and back, Blackwood would have figured out what we're doing." Jake looked up from the papers. "We need to be smarter than that." "How?" "We make him think he's winning. Let him believe you're desperate considering his offer. Meanwhile, we document everything, gather more evidence, build a case so strong that even his connections can't save him. That could take months. Or it could take days if we're lucky." Jake's eyes met Clara's. "Father Whitmore, the reverend at the colored church outside town. He's got connections to the territorial governor's office. If we can get this evidence to him, he can get it to people Blackwood can't buy." Clara thought about Thomas, about the investigation he'd been running in secret, about the price he'd paid for asking questions. She thought about Eli sleeping in the barn, finally healing from a fever that had nearly killed him. She thought about the life she'd built from nothing, destroyed in a single night by forces she was only now beginning to understand. "If we do this," she said slowly, "if we go after Blackwood, there's no going back. He'll know we're a threat. He'll come at us with everything he has. Yes. He might kill us, like he killed Thomas. Yes." Clara looked at Maria, at Jake, at the letters that represented her husband's final legacy. 2 years ago, she'd been a schoolteacher with a loving husband and a happy son. Now, she was a widow, a social outcast, a woman with nothing left to lose except the child sleeping in a borrowed barn. "Then we better make sure we win," she said. The planning session lasted until noon. Jake spread a map across the table in his kitchen the first time Clara had been inside the main house and began marking positions, routes, vulnerabilities. He moved with the methodical precision of a man who'd spent years planning military campaigns, which Clara supposed he had. "Blackwood's got 3 advantages," Jake said, pointing to various spots on the map. "Money connections and patience. But he's also got weaknesses." "Like what?" "Arrogance. He's spent so long getting everything he wants, he's forgotten what it feels like to lose." Jake tapped a spot near Clara's destroyed homestead. "And impatience. The railroad survey team arrives in 3 weeks. Whatever he's planning, he needs to move fast. So we use that against him." "Exactly. We make him think he's got more time than he does. Make him think you're broken, desperate, ready to take his offer." Jake looked at Clara. "Can you do that? Can you make him believe you've given up?" Clara thought about the last 2 years of pretending she didn't hear the whispers, didn't feel the cold shoulders, didn't notice the way mothers pulled their children close when she walked by. She'd had plenty of practice at hiding her true feelings. "I can do it." "Good. Because the next time Blackwood approaches you, I need you to seem defeated. Ask for more money, but not enough to seem greedy. Make him think you're just trying to squeeze a few extra dollars before you give in. And while I'm playing defeated widow, Maria and I get these letters to Father Whitmore. He can have them on a stage to the territorial capital by week's end." Maria, who'd been listening quietly, spoke up. "What about my land?" Blackwood's expecting an answer. "Stall him. Tell him you need time to think, to pray about it. Men like Blackwood understand religious scruples. They'll give you a few days. And then we spring the trap." Jake's smile was cold, predatory. Blackwood's been so focused on acquiring land quietly, he hasn't realized he's created a paper trail a mile wide. Every forged document, every bribed official, every threatened family, they're all connected to him. Once the territorial authorities start pulling that thread, the whole thing unravels. Clara stared at the map, at the careful markings Jake had made at the web of connections that represented 2 years of patient observation. "You've been planning this," she said quietly, "long before I showed up in your barn. I've been waiting for this. There's a difference." "Waiting for what?" Jake met her eyes, and for the first time Clara saw something beyond the careful control he maintained, like armor. For someone brave enough to help me finish what Thomas started. The moment stretched between them, heavy with implications, neither was quite ready to name. Then Eli appeared in the doorway, his drawing tablet clutched against his chest, and the spell broke. "Mama!" He held up a new picture, the same three figures from before, but this time the tall man had his arm around the woman's shoulders. "Is Mr. Jake gonna stay with us now?" Clara felt her cheeks flush. "Eli, that's not—" "Yes," Jake said quietly. Clara turned to stare at him. "For as long as your mama needs me." Jake continued, holding Eli's gaze with complete seriousness. "I made a promise to your daddy to look after you both. I don't break my promises." Eli considered this for a long moment. Then he walked to Jake, wrapped his small arms around the man's waist, and held on tight. Over the boy's head, Jake's eyes met Clara's. Something passed between them. Gratitude, maybe, or understanding, or the first tentative stirrings of something that might someday become more. "Well," Maria said dryly, breaking the silence. "I suppose that's settled then." But nothing was settled. Clara knew that. The hardest battles were still ahead, and the enemy they faced had already proven he was willing to kill to get what he wanted. Yet for the first time in 2 years, she didn't feel alone. And that perhaps was the most dangerous feeling of all. Late afternoon brought another visitor, though this one wasn't expected. Sheriff Coleman rode up slowly. His weathered face troubled his horse, picking its way carefully through the ranch's front gate. He was alone, no deputies, no officials, just an old lawman with bad news written in every line of his body. "Callahan, Mrs. Sutton." He touched his hat brim but didn't dismount. "Got something I need to tell you, something you ain't gonna like." Jake stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his belt, close to his revolver, but not threateningly so. "Speak your piece, Coleman." "Vernon Blackwood filed papers with the county this morning. He's claiming Mrs. Sutton owes him money, some debt her husband supposedly incurred before his death." "That's a lie," Clara said immediately. "Maybe so, but he's got documentation. A promissory note with your husband's signature dated 3 months before he died." Coleman shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "I ain't saying I believe it, Mrs. Sutton. But legally I got to serve you notice. You've got 30 days to pay, or Blackwood can seize your property to settle the debt." Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "How much?" $5,000. The number hit her like a physical blow. $5,000 was more money than she'd see in a lifetime. More than her property was worth even before the flood destroyed everything. It was an impossible sum designed not to be paid, designed to force her into surrender. "The signature," Jake said quietly. "It's forged. That's for a court to decide. A court that Blackwood has in his pocket." Coleman's jaw tightened. "I don't make the laws, Callahan. I just enforce them." He reached into his saddlebag and produced a document which he held out toward Clara. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Truly I am." Clara took the paper with numb fingers. The legal language swam before her eyes, but the meaning was clear enough. In 30 days, she would lose everything she had left. "There's one more thing," Coleman said, his voice dropping. "Blackwood's also filed a petition for emergency custody of your son. Claims the boy's being raised in unsafe conditions, that a widow living in a man's barn ain't fit to be a mother." The world went red. Clara was moving before she realized it, stepping toward Coleman's horse with her hands clenched into fists and fury burning in her chest. Jake caught her arm, held her back. "He can't take my son." "The court will decide that too, ma'am. I'll kill him first." The words came out cold, flat, absolutely sincere. Coleman's horse shifted nervously, and even Jake's grip on her arm tightened. "Clara," Jake's voice was low, urgent. "Not like this. He killed my husband. He destroyed my home. He turned the whole town against me." Clara's voice cracked. "I will not let him take my boy." "And he won't." Jake pulled her closer, forced her to look at him. But we do this smart, or we don't do it at all. You understand? Clara wanted to scream, wanted to grab the nearest weapon and ride into town and put a bullet between Vernon Blackwood's calculating eyes. But Jake's gaze held her steady, reminded her that there was more at stake than her own rage. Eli. Always Eli. Fine, she said finally. We do it smart. Coleman nodded, looking relieved that he wouldn't have to arrest a widow for threatening murder. You've got 30 days. I suggest you use them well. He rode away without looking back, and Clara stood in the fading afternoon light, clutching documents that represented her complete destruction. He's overplayed his hand, Jake said quietly. What? The custody petition, it's too much too fast. He's panicking. Jake took the papers from her hands, examined them with the same focused intensity he'd shown with Maria's letters. Blackwood spent years being patient, moving carefully. Now he's making big moves, taking risks. Something spooked him. What could spook a man like that? Jake looked up at her, and something like hope flickered in his gray eyes. Us, he said simply. You not taking his offer. Me standing with you. Maria's letters. He knows he's not the only one with a plan anymore. Clara thought about the idea that her defiance, her stubborn refusal to be broken, had rattled a man who'd seemed untouchable. So what do? We hit back. Tonight. The words hung in the air between them, dangerous and full of promise. How? Jake's smile was cold. Blackwood isn't the only one with friends in useful places. There's a man in town used to work at the land office before Blackwood had him fired for asking too many questions. He's been keeping records, documentation of every suspicious transaction that's crossed his desk in the last 5 years. Why would he help us? Because Blackwood destroyed his life, same as he's trying to destroy yours. Some wounds don't heal. Some debts demand payment. Clara looked toward the barn, where Eli was playing with one of Jake's gentler horses under Maria's watchful eye. Her son was laughing, actually laughing for the first time in longer than she could remember. She'd spent 2 years trying to protect him by being invisible, by accepting every indignity the town heaped on her, by building walls so high she'd nearly suffocated behind them. Maybe it was time to stop hiding and start fighting. Tonight, she agreed. Jake nodded, and something shifted between them, a recognition that they'd moved past whatever careful boundaries had existed before. They were partners now, in the truest sense of the word. And partners watched each other's backs no matter what came next. They rode out after midnight. Clara had never broken the law before, not even the small transgressions that frontier life sometimes demanded. But as she followed Jake through the darkness toward Mesquite Springs, she felt something shift inside her chest, a hardening, a settling, the recognition that justice and legality weren't always the same thing. The man's name is Henry Coldwell, Jake said quietly, his horse matching pace with hers. He kept the land office records for 12 years before Blackwood had him removed. They claimed he was stealing forged evidence to prove it, destroyed his reputation so completely nobody in town would hire him. Where is he now? Living in a shack behind the old livery stable. Drinks too much, talks to himself. People think he's crazy. Jake's voice carried an edge of anger. But he's not crazy, Clara. He's broken. There's a difference. And he has evidence. He has everything. Every suspicious transaction, every forged signature, every bribe that crossed his desk. He kept copies of it all hidden, where nobody would think to look. Jake glanced at her. The question is whether he'll trust us enough to share it. They reached the edge of town just before 2 in the morning. Mesquite Springs was dark and silent, its inhabitants locked behind shuttered windows and bolted doors. Clara had walked these streets hundreds of times as a schoolteacher, as a wife, as a respected member of the community. Now she crept through them like a thief, hunted by the very people she'd once served. The livery stable sat at the far end of Main Street, its wooden walls sagging with age and neglect. Behind it, barely visible in the moonlight, a small shack huddled against the back fence like an afterthought. Jake dismounted and tied his horse to a post. "Wait here." "No." "Clara, if this man needs to trust us, he needs to see both of us, not just the rancher who might have his own agenda." Clara swung down from her horse, her feet hitting the ground with a soft thud. "I'm the one Blackwood hurt most recently. That makes me the most believable." Jake looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression stopped him. "Fine, but stay behind me until we know it's safe." They approached the shack carefully, Jake's hand resting on his revolver. Clara's heart pounding so hard she was certain the whole town could hear it. The door was nothing more than a piece of rotted wood, hanging from leather hinges, and the smell that emanated from within made Clara's eyes water. Jake knocked twice, paused, then knocked 3 more times in a specific pattern. Silence. Then a voice rough with sleep and alcohol. "Who's there?" "Jake Callahan, I need to talk to you, Henry." More silence. Clara could hear movement inside, shuffling footsteps, the clink of glass against glass, muttered curses. Finally, the door cracked open, revealing a single bloodshot eye. "Callahan, you finally come to finish what Blackwood started. I've come to help you finish him." The eye widened slightly. The door opened a few more inches, and Clara got her first good look at Henry Coldwell. He had been a handsome man once, she could tell. The bone structure was still there beneath the bloated flesh, the intelligence still flickered in eyes dulled by drink. But years of disgrace and poverty had done their work, turning a respected official into something that barely resembled a human being. "Who's she?" "Clara Sutton, Thomas Sutton's widow." Henry's expression changed instantly. The suspicion faded, replaced by something that might have been recognition or guilt. "Thomas," he whispered. "God in heaven. Thomas. You knew my husband." Henry laughed, a hollow sound without humor. "Knew him, lady. Your husband was the only person in this whole rotten town who believed me when I said Blackwood was dirty. He was building a case using my records, connecting the dots nobody else could see." The old man's voice cracked. "And then he died, and I got fired, and every piece of evidence disappeared like smoke." "Not every piece," Jake said quietly. Henry went very still. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you're not as broken as people think, Henry. I mean, you've been sitting on copies for 3 years, waiting for someone to come along who could actually use them." The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Clara watched Henry's face, watched the war playing out behind his bloodshot eyes, fear against hope, caution against desperation. "How do you know that?" "Because it's what I would have done." Jake stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Blackwood's coming after Mrs. Sutton now. Filed papers this morning, forged debt custody petition for her son. He's using the same playbook he used on you, on a dozen other families. But this time, we're going to stop him." "Stop him." Henry laughed again, but there was something different in it now. Something that sounded almost like possibility. "You got any idea how powerful that man is? He owns the sheriff. He owns the judge. He's got connections all the way to the territorial capital." "He doesn't own everybody," Clara said, speaking for the first time since they'd arrived. "He doesn't own Father Whitmore. He doesn't own the territorial marshal. And he doesn't own us." Henry turned to look at her, really look at her for the first time. His eyes traveled over her worn dress, her calloused hands, the fierce determination in her expression. "You're Thomas's wife," he said slowly. "I remember now. He talked about you sometimes. Said you were the strongest person he knew." "Then help me prove him right." Henry was quiet for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the door and gestured them inside. The shack was exactly as terrible as Clara had expected, filthy, cramped, reeking of alcohol and despair. But Henry moved with sudden purpose, shoving aside piles of debris until he reached a loose floorboard in the corner. 3 years, he muttered as he pried up the board. 3 years I've been waiting. 3 years of pretending to be crazy so Blackwood wouldn't think I was a threat. He pulled out a leather satchel, heavy with papers. Every dirty deal he's ever made. Every family he's destroyed. Every official he's bribed. He handed the satchel to Clara, and she felt its weight settle into her hands like a promise. "There's enough in there to hang him twice over," Henry said. "But it won't matter if you can't get it to someone he can't touch." "Father Whitmore," Jake said. "He has connections to the governor's office." "Whitmore's good, honest, but Blackwood knows about him." Henry's voice dropped. "He's had men watching the colored church for months. Anyone who goes in gets followed, documented. Whitmore can't sneeze without Blackwood knowing about it." Clara felt her hope deflating like a punctured balloon. "Then how do we get the evidence out?" Henry smiled the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "That's where it gets interesting. See, Blackwood's been so focused on watching Whitmore, he forgot about someone else. Someone with even better connections." "Who?" "My sister, Margaret Coldwell. She married a man named Harrison Territorial Marshal who got himself killed in the line of duty 2 years back. His brother still works in the governor's office." Henry's smile widened. "Margaret lives about 30 miles north in a little town called Cedar Ridge. Nobody knows she's connected to me. I made sure of that when everything fell apart. She's been waiting for this moment almost as long as I have." Jake exchanged a glance with Clara. "Can she be trusted?" "With my life, with yours too." Henry's expression grew serious. "But getting to her won't be easy. Blackwood's got men on all the main roads watching for anyone who might be carrying trouble his way. You'll have to go cross-country through Comanche territory." "Comanche territory," Clara repeated. "I know it sounds bad, but there's a chief out there, Running Deer they call him, who hates Blackwood almost as much as I do. The man tried to buy sacred land from the tribe, offered them whiskey, and broken promises. Running Deer's been waiting for a chance to see him fall." The information tumbled through Clara's mind, reshaping possibilities she hadn't known existed. An ally in the wilderness. A path that Blackwood's men wouldn't expect. A chance slim but real to get the evidence where it needed to go. "I'll go," she said. Both men turned to stare at her. "Clara, no." Jake's voice was flat, final. "It's too dangerous." "It has to be me. You're too well known. Blackwood's men would recognize you in a heartbeat. Maria can't leave her property without raising suspicion. But me?" Clara smiled grimly. "Everyone thinks I'm a broken widow hiding in your barn. Nobody expects me to do anything but cry and wait for Blackwood to finish destroying me." "She's right," Henry said quietly. "A woman traveling alone wouldn't draw the same attention as a man. Especially a woman everybody's already written off." Jake's jaw tightened. "I won't let you ride through Comanche territory alone." "Then come with me. Part of the way, at least." Clara touched his arm, felt the tension thrumming through his muscles. "We can't fight Blackwood if we're too afraid to take risks, Jake." Thomas understood that. It's why he kept investigating even when he knew it was dangerous. Thomas died. Thomas died fighting for something that mattered. "Would you rather I live as a coward?" The question hung between them, sharp and unanswerable. Clara watched Jake struggle with it, watched the protective instinct war against his respect for her determination. Finally, he nodded. "We leave at dawn. Henry, you stay here. Keep acting crazy. Keep your head down. If Blackwood finds out you helped us..." "He'll kill me. I know." Henry shrugged. "I've been dead for 3 years anyway. At least this way it means something." They slipped out of the shack just as the first hints of gray began to lighten the eastern horizon. Clara clutched the satchel against her chest, feeling the weight of hope and evidence, and 3 years of patient waiting. They were almost to their horses when a voice cut through the darkness. "Well, well, isn't this interesting?" Clara's blood turned to ice. Wade Garrett stepped out of the shadows, a pistol in his hand, and a smile on his face that made her skin crawl. Behind him, 2 more men emerged, rough-looking, armed with the cold eyes of professionals who didn't ask questions about their work. I had a feeling you'd show up here eventually, Callahan. Blackwood said I was wasting my time watching this old drunk, but I know how these things work. Garrett's smile widened. What's in the bag, Mrs. Sutton? Clara's mind raced. The satchel contained every piece of evidence they needed to destroy Blackwood, if Garrett got his hands on it. Nothing, she said. Just some old clothes Henry gave me. Really? Garrett gestured with his pistol. Then you won't mind if I take a look. Jake moved so fast, Clara barely saw it happen. One moment he was standing beside her. The next he was between her and Garrett, his own revolver drawn and leveled at the lawyer's chest. I don't think so. Garrett's smile faltered. You're making a mistake, Callahan. Blackwood has resources you can't imagine. Men, money, influence that reaches all the way to Washington. You really want to bet your life on a widow and some dusty papers? I've bet my life on less. The standoff stretched between them, tension crackling like summer lightning. Clara could see Garrett calculating the odds 3 men against 1, but Jake Callahan had a reputation that preceded him. The man had been a Texas Ranger for 15 years. He'd killed more outlaws than most men had met. Garrett was a lawyer, not a gunfighter, and they both knew it. This isn't over, Garrett said, finally lowering his weapon. Not by a long shot. No, it isn't. Jake's voice was cold as winter steel. Tell Blackwood we're coming for him. Tell him everything he's built is about to come crashing down. And tell him when it does, I'm going to be standing in the rubble watching him burn. Garrett's face twisted with fury, but he stepped back, gesturing for his men to do the same. You've just signed your own death warrant, Callahan, both of you. They disappeared into the darkness, and Clara released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. We need to go, Jake said. Now, before they come back with reinforcements. They mounted their horses and rode hard toward the edge of town, the satchel bouncing against Clara's side with every stride. Behind them, the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, painting the Texas sky in shades of fire and blood. But Clara barely noticed. Her mind was already racing ahead, planning the journey to come the dangers they would face, the allies they needed to find. Blackwood knew they were coming now. The element of surprise was gone. But they had something more powerful than surprise. They had the truth. And one way or another, they were going to make sure the world heard it. They rode through the morning without stopping, pushing their horses hard toward the ranch. Clara's arms ached from clutching the satchel, but she refused to secure it to her saddle. If something happened, if they were ambushed, if she fell, she needed to know exactly where the evidence was at every moment. Jake rode beside her in grim silence, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for threats. The easy partnership they'd developed over the past few days had shifted into something more urgent, more desperate. They reached the ranch just past noon to find chaos. Maria stood in the yard, a shotgun in her hands, her face streaked with tears. Eli sat behind her on the porch steps, his drawing tablet clutched against his chest, his small body shaking with silent sobs. They came, Maria said, before Clara could even dismount. An hour after you left, 3 men official-looking with papers from the court. Clara's heart stopped. Eli, I didn't let them take him. Told them they'd have to shoot me first. Maria's voice cracked. But they'll be back, Clara. They said they'd be back with the sheriff and a warrant. Clara was off her horse in an instant, running to her son and pulling him into her arms. Eli buried his face against her shoulder, his small hands fisting in the fabric of her dress, his body trembling against hers. It's okay, baby, she whispered. Mama's here. Mama's not going to let anyone take you. But even as she spoke the words, she knew they might be a lie. Jake was already moving barking orders to Maria, checking sightlines and defensive positions with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd defended worse positions against worse odds. They'll come back with force this time, he said. Blackwood's done playing nice. He knows we have the evidence. Then we leave now. Clara looked up from Eli's hair, her jaw set with determination. We ride for Cedar Ridge, all of us. Clara, that's 30 miles through rough country. With a child? With my child, my son. Clara stood, lifting Eli with her, the boy's legs wrapping around her waist. I am not leaving him here for Blackwood's men to snatch while I'm gone. Either he comes with us, or I don't go at all. Jake looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression stopped him. He'd learned Clara realized that certain battles weren't worth fighting. Maria stays, he said finally. Someone needs to be here when the sheriff comes, or they'll know we've run. She can buy us time. Maria nodded, her grip tightening on the shotgun. I'll tell them you went to town. Stall them as long as I can. You could get hurt? I've been hurt before. Maria's eyes met Clara's. Go. Get that evidence to someone who can use it. Make Thomas and Miguel's deaths mean something. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to insist that Maria come with them, but there was no time. Even now, Blackwood's men could be regrouping, planning their next move. They were mounted and riding within minutes, Eli seated in front of Clara on her horse, his small body pressed against hers. The satchel hung from Jake's saddle. Now he'd insisted, saying he could protect it better if his hands were free. The sun beat down on them as they rode northwest toward the rough country that bordered Comanche territory. Clara had heard stories about this land travelers who disappeared, settlements that vanished overnight, the ways that the wilderness could swallow a person whole without leaving a trace. But she'd also heard stories about Running Deer, a chief who had chosen peace over war, a leader who understood that the old ways were dying and that survival meant adaptation. If Henry Coldwell was right, Running Deer might be their only ally between Mesquite Springs and Cedar Ridge. They rode until the horses were lathered and Eli was drooping with exhaustion. Jake found a sheltered spot near a creek, hidden from casual observation by a cluster of cottonwood trees. We rest here, he said, helping Clara down from her horse. 2 hours, no more. I want to be through the worst of it before nightfall. Clara settled Eli against a tree trunk, using her shawl as a pillow for his head. The boy was asleep almost instantly, his face smooth and peaceful in a way it rarely was when he was awake. He trusts you, Jake said quietly, watching from a few feet away. He's 7. He trusts everyone. No. He's been through things that would break most adults. He doesn't trust easily, not anymore. Jake moved closer, sat down beside her. But he trusts you. And he trusts me. Clara felt something shift in her chest. Jake? I know this isn't the time. I know there's 1,000 things we need to worry about that don't include... He stopped, ran a hand through his hair. But I need you to know something, in case things go wrong. Don't talk like that. I have to. Jake turned to face her fully, his gray eyes intense in the dappled sunlight. 2 years ago, I was a dead man walking. Everything I'd done in the Apache Wars, everything I'd failed to stop it, was eating me alive. I thought about ending it more times than I can count. Jake? But then I made a promise to a dying man, and keeping that promise gave me something to live for. He reached out, took her hand in his. Watching you, Clara. Watching you fight when anyone else would have given up. Watching you build a life from nothing, raise your son alone, refuse to let them break you. It made me want to be the kind of man who deserved to keep that promise. Clara felt tears building behind her eyes. I'm not strong. I'm just too stubborn to quit. That is strength. Jake's grip tightened on her hand. And somewhere along the way, keeping that promise became about more than just honoring Thomas. It became about you. About wanting to see you safe. About wanting to see you happy. The confession hung between them, fragile and precious as spring ice. I can't think about this right now, Clara whispered. Not with everything. I know, I'm not asking for anything. Jake released her hand, but his eyes remained fixed on hers. I just needed you to know. Whatever happens next, however this ends, you're not just Thomas's widow to me. Not anymore. Clara wanted to say something, wanted to tell him that she felt it too, The pull between them, the way her heart beat faster when he was near. But the words caught in her throat, tangled up with grief and fear and the terrible weight of everything they still had to survive. Instead, she reached out and touched his face just briefly, just enough to let him know she understood. "When this is over," she said softly, "when Blackwood is done and Eli is safe, then we can talk about what comes next." Jake nodded, something like hope flickering in his gray eyes. "When this is over." They sat in silence after that, watching Eli sleep, listening to the wind move through the cottonwood leaves. For a few precious minutes, the world felt almost peaceful. Then Jake's head snapped up, his body going tense. "Riders," he said quietly. "Coming fast." Clara was on her feet in an instant, scooping Eli into her arms before the boy was even fully awake. Jake grabbed the satchel and the horse's reins, leading them deeper into the trees. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer. 5 riders, maybe 6, moving with the purposeful speed of men who knew exactly where they were going. "Blackwood's men," Clara whispered. "Can't tell yet. Stay down." They pressed themselves against the largest cottonwood, barely breathing, as the riders crested the small rise and stopped at the creek's edge. Clara could see them now, rough men armed with the hard faces of hired guns rather than lawmen. One of them dismounted and knelt beside the water, examining the ground. "Tracks here," he called to the others. "Fresh. 3 horses, one of them carrying double weight." Clara's heart nearly stopped. Eli stirred in her arms, and she pressed her hand gently over his mouth, praying he wouldn't make a sound. "They can't be far," another rider said. "Fan out. Check the trees." Jake's hand moved to his revolver, his thumb quietly releasing the hammer. Clara could see him calculating 5 men, all armed, against one former ranger with a widow and child to protect. The odds were terrible. But sometimes terrible odds were the only ones you got. The searchers moved closer, their horses picking through the underbrush with practiced ease. Clara could hear them now, the creak of leather, the jingle of spurs, the low murmur of men who expected easy prey. 20 yards. 15. 10. And then from somewhere to the north a sound split the air, a high, ululating cry that made Clara's blood turn cold. The hired guns froze. "What the hell was that?" one of them demanded. The cry came again, closer this time, and suddenly the air was full of movement, riders appearing from the trees on all sides, mounted on painted horses, their faces marked with designs that Clara didn't recognize but understood instinctively. Comanche. The hired guns reached for their weapons, but they were surrounded before any of them could draw. A single rider moved forward from the group, older than the others, his bearing radiating authority even without words. Running Deer. It had to be. "You ride on land that does not belong to you," the chief said. His English accented, but clear. "Looking for people who do not wish to be found." The leader of the hired guns, a scarred man with mean eyes, tried to bluster. "We're on official business. Sheriff's orders." "The sheriff has no authority here." Running Deer's voice was flat, final. "Turn around. Go back to your town. Tell the man who pays you that this land remembers what he has done, and it does not forgive." For a long moment, Clara thought the scarred man might try to fight. His hand hovered near his gun, his jaw working with frustration and fear. But even hired guns knew when they were beaten. 5 against 15 was suicide, especially against Comanche warriors, who knew this land like they knew their own heartbeats. "This isn't over," the scarred man growled. "No." Running Deer agreed. "It is not." The hired guns turned and rode away, casting furious glances over their shoulders. Only when they had disappeared over the ridge did the Comanche chief turn his attention to the cottonwood grove. "You can come out now, Jake Callahan. I know you're there." Clara felt Jake tense beside her, then slowly rise from his hiding position, his hands raised and empty. "Running Deer. It's been a long time. 3 winters since you pulled my grandson from the river." Running Deer dismounted, approached on foot. I told you then that I would repay the debt. It seems that day has come. Jake helped Clara up and she stepped out of the trees with Eli in her arms, her heart still racing from their close escape. Running Deer's eyes moved over her assessing measuring. "The widow," he said. "Henry Coldwell said you might come this way. You know Henry? We have common enemies." Running Deer's expression was unreadable. "The man who calls himself Blackwood tried to buy our sacred springs with whiskey and lies. When we refused, he poisoned our winter grazing land. 30 horses died." His voice hardened. "My people do not forget such things." Clara clutched the satchel against her chest. "We have evidence. Proof of everything Blackwood has done, not just to us, but to dozens of families. We need to get it to Cedar Ridge to someone who can use it." Running Deer studied her for a long moment. Then slowly, he nodded. "My warriors will escort you to the edge of our territory. From there you will be on your own, but Blackwood's men will not follow you through our lands." He paused. "There is a price. Name it. When Blackwood falls, and he will fall, I want his poisoned land given back to my people. Not sold, not traded. Given." Clara looked at Jake, saw him nod almost imperceptibly. "Done," she said. Running Deer's face remained impassive, but something shifted in his dark eyes. Respect maybe, or simply the recognition of a deal fairly struck. "Then we ride," he said. "The sun waits for no one, and Cedar Ridge is still many miles away." They mounted up Eli, seated in front of Clara once again, and fell into formation with the Comanche warriors. As they rode deeper into the wilderness, Clara allowed herself to feel something she had almost forgotten existed. Hope. Real, tangible hope that they might actually survive this. That Blackwood might actually pay for what he'd done. That there might be a future waiting on the other side of all this darkness. She looked at Jake riding beside her with the satchel of evidence secured to his saddle, and felt her heart do something complicated and wonderful. When this is over, she'd told him. And for the first time, she truly believed there would be an after to look forward to. Running Deer's warriors left them at the edge of Comanche territory, just as the sun began its descent toward the western hills. Clara counted 12 miles of hard riding behind them, 12 miles where Blackwood's hired guns couldn't follow. But Cedar Ridge was still 18 miles ahead, and darkness was coming fast. "There is a trading post 5 miles north," Running Deer said, pointing toward a gap in the distant ridgeline. "Samuel Whitehorse runs it. Tell him I sent you. He will give you fresh horses and safe passage through the night." Jake extended his hand. "I won't forget this. See that you don't." Running Deer clasped his forearm in the warrior's grip. "And when Blackwood falls, remember your promise. My people have waited long enough for justice." The Comanche warriors melted back into the wilderness like ghosts, leaving Clara and Jake alone with Eli and the precious satchel of evidence. For a moment, the silence felt overwhelming, the weight of everything they carried, everything they risked, everything that still lay ahead. Then Eli tugged at Clara's sleeve. "Mama, I'm hungry." The simple words broke through the tension like sunlight through clouds. Clara laughed, a surprised, genuine sound that seemed to startle even herself. "Me too, baby. Let's find that trading post." They rode north through the gathering dusk, pushing their tired horses as hard as they dared. Clara's arms ached from holding Eli, and her back screamed from hours in the saddle, but she refused to slow down. Every minute they delayed was a minute for Blackwood to discover where they'd gone. The trading post appeared just as the last light faded from the sky, a squat building of adobe and timber, its windows glowing with warm lamplight. A weathered sign above the door read, "Whitehorse Trading Company," in letters that had seen better days. Jake dismounted first, his hand resting on his revolver as he scanned the area for threats. "Stay here until I know it's safe." "Jake." "Please, Clara. Just this once." Something in his voice made her nod. She watched him approach the trading post, door knock twice, exchange words with whoever answered. A moment later, he turned and waved her forward. Samuel Whitehorse was a half-blood Apache, with intelligent eyes and hands scarred from decades of frontier commerce. He listened to their story without interruption, his expression growing darker with each revelation. "Running Deer sent you," he said when Jake finished. "That's good enough for me. But you should know Blackwood's men came through here 2 hours ago, 4 of them riding hard for Cedar Ridge." Clara's heart sank. "They know where we're going." "They know you're headed north. Cedar Ridge is the only destination that makes sense." Whitehorse moved to a shelf behind the counter, began pulling down supplies. "But there's more than one way to get there. The main road goes through Miller's Pass, that's where they'll be waiting. The old mining trail goes around the mountain. Takes longer, but nobody uses it anymore." "Can we make it by morning?" "If you ride through the night, if your horses don't give out, if the weather holds." Whitehorse shrugged. "Lots of ifs, but it's better odds than riding into an ambush." Jake looked at Clara, the question clear in his eyes. She thought about Eli, exhausted and hungry. Thought about herself running on nothing but fear and determination. Thought about the satchel of evidence that represented 3 years of patient gathering and 2 lives lost. "We ride," she said. Whitehorse provided fresh horses food and detailed directions to the old mining trail. He refused payment, saying only that Running Deer's friends were his friends, and that some debts couldn't be measured in dollars. They set out just after midnight, following a path that wound through rocky terrain and dense scrub. Eli slept fitfully against Clara's chest, occasionally mumbling words she couldn't understand. Jake rode ahead, his eyes constantly scanning for danger, his body tense with the vigilance of a man who expected trouble around every corner. The hours blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and adrenaline. Clara lost track of time, lost track of distance, lost track of everything except the rhythm of her horse's hooves and the weight of her son in her arms. Dawn found them cresting the final ridge above Cedar Ridge. The town spread out below them like a promise, buildings and streets, and people going about their ordinary lives, unaware of the desperate riders descending from the mountains. Clara spotted the church steeple first, then the mercantile, then a modest house on the edge of town, with a white picket fence that seemed almost absurdly civilized. "That's Margaret's house," Jake said, pointing. "Henry's sister, the one with connections to the governor's office." "How do you know?" "I've been preparing for this moment longer than you realize." Jake turned to look at her, and despite his exhaustion, there was something like hope in his gray eyes. "We made it, Clara. We actually made it." But Clara had learned not to celebrate too early. "We're not done yet." They rode down into Cedar Ridge as the town was waking up, shopkeepers opening their doors, children running to school, ordinary people living ordinary lives. Clara felt conspicuous in her trail-worn clothes, her unwashed hair, her son sleeping against her shoulder. But nobody paid them much attention. In a frontier town, strangers were common enough to ignore. Margaret Harrison's house was neat and well-maintained, with flowers blooming in window boxes and a welcome mat by the front door. Clara dismounted slowly, her legs nearly buckling after hours in the saddle. Jake knocked. The woman who answered was in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair and the sharp, intelligent eyes of her brother. She took one look at Jake, one look at Clara, one look at the satchel in Jake's hands, and stepped aside without a word. "You're Henry's friends," she said once they were inside. "I've been expecting you." "How did you know?" "My brother sent word through channels Blackwood doesn't know about. Told me everything." Margaret's voice was brisk, businesslike. "The evidence, the forged documents, the families he's destroyed. I've been in contact with the Territorial Marshal's office. They're sending an investigator." Clara felt her knees go weak with relief. "When?" "He's already here. Arrived yesterday on the stage from Austin." Margaret moved to the window, peered out at the street. "But there's a problem. Blackwood's lawyer, Wade Garrett, rode into town last night. He's been meeting with people, spreading money around, trying to get ahead of whatever you're bringing. Can he stop the investigation? He can delay it, muddy the waters, cast doubt on the evidence." Margaret turned back to face them. "The marshal's name is James Thornton. Good man, honest but careful. He won't move without solid proof, And Garrett's already working to make your proof look questionable. Jake's jaw tightened. Then we need to get to Thornton before Garrett does. That's exactly what we need to do. Margaret reached for her coat. He's staying at the Cedar Ridge Hotel. I'll take you there now. They left Eli sleeping in Margaret's guest room, too exhausted to wake even when Clara kissed his forehead. Part of her wanted to stay to hold her son and never let go, but she'd come too far to stop now. The Cedar Ridge Hotel was a two-story building on Main Street, more respectable than Clara had expected. Margaret led them through the lobby and up the stairs to a corner room where she knocked in a specific pattern. The man who answered was younger than Clara expected, maybe 35, with a lawman's bearing and eyes that missed nothing. He looked at Margaret, then at Jake, then at Clara, his expression revealing nothing. "Mrs. Harrison, I see you've brought company. Marshal Thornton, this is Jake Callahan and Clara Sutton. They have evidence regarding the matters we discussed." Thornton's eyes sharpened at Jake's name. "Callahan, you were a ranger once. Long time ago. I've heard stories." Thornton stepped aside, gesturing them into the room. "Come in. Show me what you've got." They spread the contents of the satchel across the bed. Henry Coldwell's meticulous records. Maria Santos's letters, documents that traced 3 years of fraud and intimidation and murder. Jake explained each piece, connecting dots that formed a damning picture of Vernon Blackwood's empire. Thornton listened without interrupting, his face growing more serious with each revelation. When Jake finished, the marshal was quiet for a long moment. "This is good," he said finally. "Better than good. With this evidence, I can arrest Blackwood and everyone connected to him." "But," Clara asked, hearing the hesitation in his voice. "But Wade Garrett has already filed injunctions in 3 different courts. He's claiming that any evidence gathered by Mrs. Sutton is tainted, that she has personal grievances that make her testimony unreliable." Thornton met her eyes directly. "He's also claiming that Jake Callahan coerced you into fabricating charges, that you're his mistress, and this is all some scheme to destroy a rival." Clara felt rage building in her chest. "That's a lie." "I know it's a lie. But courts deal in perception as much as truth. If Garrett can create enough doubt, he can delay prosecution indefinitely. And in that time, evidence disappears. Witnesses have accidents. The whole case falls apart. So what do we do?" Thornton was quiet for another long moment. Then, he made a decision that Clara could see forming in his expression before he spoke. "We move fast. Today. Before Garrett has time to set up any more roadblocks." He began gathering the documents, organizing them with practiced efficiency. "I'll need sworn statements from both of you. Mrs. Harrison, can you serve as a witness?" "Gladly." "Good. Once I have the paperwork in order, I'll telegraph the governor's office directly. Blackwood's connections don't reach that high, not yet. If we can get authorization for immediate arrest before Garrett knows what's happening, then it's over," Jake finished. "Then it's over." They worked through the morning, documenting everything, creating an unassailable record of Blackwood's crimes. Clara's hand cramped from signing statements, but she pushed through the pain. Every signature brought them closer to justice. Every page turned was another nail in Blackwood's coffin. Just past noon, Thornton sent his telegraph. They waited in Margaret's parlor, the tension thick enough to choke on. Eli had woken and sat in Clara's lap, his small hands holding his drawing tablet, sketching pictures of horses and houses and stick figures that might have been family. The reply came 2 hours later. Thornton read it, his face expressionless. Then slowly he smiled. "Authorization granted. I'm to arrest Vernon Blackwood on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and murder." He looked at Clara, Jake, Margaret. "It's done. We've got him." Clara wanted to cry, wanted to scream, wanted to fall to her knees and thank God for delivering them through impossible odds. But she didn't do any of those things. Instead, she held her son tighter and whispered the only words that mattered. "It's over, baby. The bad man can't hurt us anymore." Eli looked up at her with those serious, too old eyes. Then, for the first time in weeks, he smiled. "I know, Mama. Mr. Jake promised." The return to Mesquite Springs took 3 days, 3 days of traveling with Marshal Thornton and 4 territorial deputies, 3 days of moving closer to the moment when everything would change. Clara rode beside Jake Eli, dozing against her chest, the exhaustion of their flight finally catching up with all of them. But beneath the tiredness, she felt something else growing, something that felt like hope. "What happens after?" she asked quietly, low enough that only Jake could hear. "After what?" "After Blackwood's arrested. After the trials. After all of this is done." Jake was quiet for a long moment. "I've been thinking about that," he said finally. "Your land, the property he was trying to steal, it's still yours. With him gone, you could rebuild. Start fresh." "On my own." The question hung between them, loaded with meaning. "That depends," Jake said slowly, "on whether you want to be on your own." Clara thought about the last week, the danger they'd faced together, the moments of connection in the midst of chaos, the way Jake had stood by her when everyone else had abandoned hope. She thought about Thomas, about the promise he'd extracted from a friend, about the kind of love that thought about the future, even in the moment of death. "Thomas wanted us to be taken care of," she said. "But I don't think he wanted me to spend my whole life alone." "No," Jake agreed. "He wouldn't have." "Then, maybe—" Clara hesitated, the words catching in her throat. "Maybe when this is over we could talk about what comes next. Really talk without running for our lives or worrying about hired guns." Jake's hand reached across the space between their horses, found hers. "I'd like that." They rode on in comfortable silence after that, two people who had been through fire together and come out the other side. Whatever happened next, Clara knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone anymore. And that made all the difference. Mesquite Springs appeared on the horizon just as the sun began to set, its familiar buildings silhouetted against the orange sky. Clara's heart quickened, a mixture of anticipation and dread. This was the town that had rejected her, whispered about her, tried to destroy her. In a few hours, everyone who had called her cursed would have to face the truth about the man they'd protected instead. Marshal Thornton called a halt just outside town. "Blackwood's home is on the north end," he said, addressing his deputies. "We go in quiet, fast. Don't give him time to destroy evidence or escape." "What about the sheriff?" one deputy asked. "He's been on Blackwood's payroll for years." "Sheriff Coleman gets dealt with later. Right now, Blackwood's the priority." They rode into town as darkness fell, moving through back streets to avoid attention. Clara had insisted on being there, had refused to wait safely at Margaret's house while others finished what she'd started. Thornton had argued, but Jake had backed her up. "She's earned the right to see this through," he'd said. "Don't take that away from her." Blackwood's mansion sat on a hill overlooking the town, a massive structure that had always seemed to Clara like a monument to greed. Tonight it looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable, just a building like any other. Thornton and his deputies surrounded the house. One man went to the front door. Others covered the back, the windows, any possible escape route. Clara waited with Jake at the edge of the property, Eli safely with Maria back at the ranch. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her teeth. The knock echoed through the quiet evening. A long pause. Then the door opened, and Vernon Blackwood stepped out onto his porch, still dressed for dinner, a glass of wine in his hand. "Marshal Thornton, what an unexpected pleasure. Is there something I can help you with?" His voice was smooth, confident, the voice of a man who believed himself untouchable. Clara wanted to scream at him, wanted to throw every piece of evidence in his face and watch his composure crack. But Thornton handled it better. "Vernon Blackwood, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and the murder of Thomas Sutton. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say." "This is absurd." Blackwood's smile never wavered. "I've committed no crime. Whatever evidence you think you have is fabricated lies spread by a bitter widow and a disgraced rancher with a grudge. We have Henry Coldwell's records, every transaction, every bribe, every forged document. Thornton stepped closer. We have letters from Miguel Santos detailing the robbery that killed Thomas Sutton. We have testimony from 24 families you tried to destroy. For the first time, something flickered in Blackwood's eyes. Fear. Coldwell is a drunk. Santos is dead. No court will. The territorial governor has already reviewed the evidence. Your arrest has been authorized at the highest level. Thornton produced handcuffs. Turn around, Mr. Blackwood. This is over. Clara watched Blackwood's face as the reality sank in. Watched his composure crack. Watched the smooth confidence dissolve into something ugly and desperate. You think this changes anything? His voice rose, the cultured tones giving way to something raw. I built this town. I own half the territory. You arrest me and everything falls apart. Businesses, jobs, families who depend on my money. They'll survive, Thornton said flatly. People are more resilient than men like you give them credit for. This is Jake Callahan's doing, him and that cursed widow. Blackwood's eyes found Clara in the darkness, and the hatred in them made her blood run cold. You think you've won. I have connections everywhere. Friends in places you can't imagine. This isn't over. It's just beginning. No. Clara stepped forward, her voice steady, despite the fear hammering in her chest. It's ending. Right here, right now. You killed my husband. You tried to take my home, my son, my life. But you failed. She met his gaze without flinching. Thomas saw through you years ago. He knew what you were, and even from the grave he found a way to stop you. Blackwood lunged toward her, his face twisted with rage, but Thornton's deputies caught him before he could take 2 steps. They forced the handcuffs onto his wrists, pushed him toward the waiting wagon. This isn't over, Blackwood screamed as they dragged him away. I'll destroy you! I'll destroy everyone who— The wagon door slammed shut, cutting off his threats. And just like that, it was done. Clara stood in the darkness outside Blackwood's mansion, her legs trembling, her heart still racing. Jake appeared beside her, his hand finding hers in the darkness. You did it, he said quietly. You finished what Thomas started. We did it. Clara turned to face him, saw the exhaustion and relief and something else in his gray eyes. I couldn't have done any of this without you. Maybe not, but you would have tried. Jake's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. That's what Thomas saw in you. That's what I see in you. Clara felt tears building behind her eyes. Tears she'd been holding back for 3 years, for 2 weeks, for this single moment when she could finally let go. Take me home, she whispered. Take me back to Eli. Which home? The barn? Or— Jake hesitated. Or somewhere else. Clara thought about her destroyed cabin, about the land that had almost cost her everything. Thought about Jake's ranch, about the warm barn where she'd first felt safe. Thought about the future that was suddenly impossibly open before her. I don't know yet, she said honestly. But I know I don't want to figure it out alone. Jake squeezed her hand. You won't have to. They walked back to their horses together, leaving Blackwood's empire crumbling behind them. Tomorrow, there would be trials and testimonies, and the long, slow work of rebuilding everything that had been destroyed. But tonight, Clara allowed herself to believe that the worst was over, and for the first time in 3 years, she was right. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Clara sat in the front row of the territorial courthouse every single day, Eli beside her, Jake on her other side. She watched Vernon Blackwood's empire unravel piece by piece, watched witness after witness take the stand and speak truths that had been buried for years. Henry Coldwell testified first, his voice steady and clear despite the trembling in his hands. The jury listened as he described 12 years of keeping records of watching fraud unfold before his eyes of being destroyed when he tried to speak up. "Mr. Blackwood had me fired," Henry said, his eyes finding Clara's in the gallery. "Forged evidence that I was stealing. Destroyed my reputation so completely that I had to pretend to be crazy just to survive." "And why did you keep copies of these documents?" the prosecutor asked. "Because I knew someday someone would be brave enough to use them." Maria Santos testified next, her voice breaking as she read from her dead husband's letters. Miguel had documented everything. The men who attacked the train, the money that changed hands, the connection that led straight back to Blackwood's office. "My husband died for this truth," Maria said. "And Mrs. Sutton's husband died for it too. The least I can do is make sure their deaths meant something." Family after family came forward, the Hendersons, the Millers, the Crawfords, each one telling the same story. Mysterious debts, forged signatures, threats that grew louder until they sold their land for pennies on the dollar. "We were afraid," Mrs. Crawford whispered, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Blackwood owned everything. The bank, the sheriff, the judge. We didn't think anyone could stop him." "But someone did," the prosecutor said quietly. "Yes." Mrs. Crawford looked at Clara, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of forgiveness. Someone did. The testimony that broke the case came on the 14th day. Wade Garrett had been arrested trying to flee to Mexico, his saddlebags stuffed with cash and incriminating documents. Faced with the choice between testifying against Blackwood or hanging alongside him, he chose survival. "Vernon planned everything," Garrett said from the witness stand, his voice hollow with defeat. "The train robbery, the murders, all of it. Thomas Sutton was getting too close to the truth, so Vernon hired men to make it look like a random attack." Clara's hands clenched in her lap. Beside her, Jake went very still. "And what was your role in these events, Mr. Garrett?" "I handled the legal side. Forged documents, manufactured debts, filed papers to take property from people who couldn't fight back." Garrett's eyes dropped to the floor. "I told myself it was just business, just paperwork. But I knew what I was doing. I knew who I was helping." "And the night you confronted Mr. Callahan and Mrs. Sutton outside Henry Coldwell's residence, Vernon sent me to stop them. Said if they got that evidence to anyone who mattered, everything would fall apart." Garrett laughed bitterly. "He was right about that, at least." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Clara heard the verdict through a haze of tears. Tears she couldn't stop, didn't want to stop. 3 years of grief and fear and stubborn survival finally finding release. Jake's arm wrapped around her shoulders, and Eli pressed against her side, and somewhere in the gallery, she heard Maria sobbing with relief. Vernon Blackwood stood motionless as the judge pronounced his sentence. Life imprisonment. No possibility of parole. His empire seized his fortune, distributed to the families he had destroyed. As the bailiffs led him away, Blackwood turned to look at Clara one final time. His eyes burned with hatred. But there was something else there too, fear maybe, or the dawning recognition that he had finally met someone he couldn't break. "This isn't justice," he spat. "This is revenge." Clara stood, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "No, Mr. Blackwood. This is consequences. Something you should have learned about a long time ago." The courtroom erupted in applause, but Clara barely heard it. She was already pushing through the crowd toward the doors, toward the fresh air and sunlight, toward the life that was finally impossibly waiting for her on the other side. The weeks after the trial passed in a blur of rebuilding and reckoning. Clara's land was returned to her, cleared of all false claims and debts. The territorial government offered her compensation for the harassment she'd endured, enough money to rebuild her cabin twice over with funds left to spare. But Clara didn't rebuild on her old property. "It's too full of ghosts," she told Jake one evening as they sat on his porch watching Eli play with the horses in the corral. "Too many bad memories mixed in with the good ones." "What do you want to do with it?" Clara had been thinking about that question for days, turning possibilities over in her mind like stones in a riverbed. Running Deer kept his promise about Blackwood. I want to keep mine. Give the land back to his people, the springs, the grazing areas, everything Blackwood tried to poison. Jake nodded slowly. That's a good choice. It's the right choice. Clara watched Eli laugh as one of the gentler mares nuzzled his hair. Thomas would have approved. Thomas would have been proud of you. The words hit Clara harder than she expected, opening a door she'd kept carefully closed for 3 years. I still miss him, she admitted quietly. Every day. I keep thinking I should feel guilty for surviving, for moving on, for finding happiness again. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. I knew Thomas better than almost anyone, he said. We rode together for 5 years, faced death together more times than I can count. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that he would want you to be happy. Not just surviving. Happy. How can you be so sure? Because it's what he made me promise. Not just to protect you and Eli, to make sure you had a chance at a real life. A full life. Jake's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. He loved you enough to think about your future even when he was dying. That's not the kind of love that demands eternal mourning. Clara felt tears building again, but these were different, cleaner, somehow less weighted with guilt. I'm scared, she admitted, of hoping for too much, of losing everything again. I know, me too. Jake turned to face her fully, his gray eyes serious and vulnerable in a way she'd rarely seen. But I'd rather be scared and trying than safe and alone. Wouldn't you? Before Clara could answer, Eli came running toward the porch, his face flushed with excitement and his drawing tablet clutched against his chest. Mama! Mr. Jake! Look what I drawed! He thrust the tablet toward them, and Clara felt her heart skip as she saw the picture. 3 figures stood in front of a house, a woman, a man, and a small boy. Above them, in Eli's careful handwriting, were the words, My family. Jake's hand tightened on hers. Is this what you want, sweetheart? Clara asked, her voice barely steady. For Mr. Jake to be part of our family. Eli nodded with the solemn certainty of childhood. He makes you smile, Mama. And he teaches me about horses. And he promised Daddy he'd take care of us. The boy looked between them, his expression far too wise for 7 years old. I think Daddy would want him to stay. Clara looked at Jake, saw her own hope reflected in his eyes. What do you think? I think, Jake said slowly, that your son is the smartest person in Texas. Eli beamed. Does that mean you'll stay? Yeah, partner. Jake reached out and ruffled the boy's hair. I reckon it does. The wedding took place 3 months later in the same church where the town had once whispered about Clara's curse. Father Whitmore officiated, his deep voice carrying through the packed pews as he spoke about second chances and redemption and the mysterious ways that love could grow from tragedy. Half the town was there, the same people who had turned their backs on Clara, who had called her cursed, who had watched her struggle without lifting a finger to help. Now they sat in their Sunday best, many of them with tears in their eyes, watching her marry the man who had proven them all wrong. Clara wore a simple dress of cream-colored cotton, nothing fancy, nothing that would have been out of place on any ranch wife in the territory. But she felt beautiful in a way she hadn't felt in years. Beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with fabric or fashion, and everything to do with the way Jake looked at her as she walked down the aisle. Eli walked beside her, serving as both ring-bearer and the closest thing to a father of the bride they were likely to find. He carried the rings on a small velvet pillow, his face serious with concentration, his steps careful and measured. Maria stood at the front as Clara's witness, her eyes bright with happy tears. She had chosen to stay in Mesquite Springs after the trial, using her share of the settlement to rebuild her own small homestead. We've been through fire together. she'd told Clara. "That makes us family now, whether we share blood or not." Running Deer had sent a gift, a beautifully woven blanket in traditional patterns, along with a message that Clara had read a dozen times. "May your new beginning be blessed with peace and plenty. The land remembers those who honor it." Henry Coldwell sat in the front row, sober for the first time in years, dressed in a suit that Margaret had bought him for the occasion. He looked like a different man than the broken creature Clara had met in that filthy shack, older certainly, and marked by the years of suffering, but with a dignity in his bearing that hadn't been there before. "You gave me my life back," he'd told Clara when she invited him. "Least I can do is watch you start yours." Even Sheriff Coleman was there, though he kept to the back and avoided meeting anyone's eyes. He'd been stripped of his badge after the trial, but the territorial authorities had declined to prosecute him. His cooperation in the final days had earned him that much mercy, if not respect. Father Whitmore's voice rose to fill the church. "Do you, Jacob Callahan, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" Jake's gray eyes never left Clara's face. "I do." "And do you, Clara Sutton, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Clara thought about Thomas, about the love they'd shared and the life they'd built together. Thought about the years of struggle and survival, about the darkness that had nearly swallowed her whole. Thought about the man standing before her, now the man who had watched over her from the shadows for 3 years, who had stood beside her when everyone else had walked away. "I do. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Texas and the grace of Almighty God, I pronounce you husband and wife." Father Whitmore smiled a genuine warmth that seemed to fill the church. "Jake, you may kiss your bride." Jake cupped her face in his scarred, calloused hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made Clara's heart ache in the best possible way. Around them, the congregation burst into applause, genuine applause, not the polite clapping of obligation, but the celebration of people who had witnessed something true and beautiful rise from the ashes of tragedy. When they finally broke apart, Eli was tugging at Jake's coat. "Does this mean I can call you Pa now?" Jake knelt down to the boy's level, his expression serious, despite the joy shining in his eyes. "Only if you want to partner. I'm not trying to replace your daddy." "I know." Eli reached out and touched the small scar on Jake's chin, a souvenir from some long-ago adventure that Clara had never asked about. "But Daddy's in heaven now, and you're here, and I think—" The boy paused, considering his words with that careful thoughtfulness that had always been his nature. "I think maybe there's room in my heart for both." Clara felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but she didn't bother to wipe them away. "That's the wisest thing I've ever heard, sweetheart." "Does that mean yes?" Eli asked Jake. Jake pulled the boy into a fierce hug, his voice rough with emotion. "Yeah, son, that means yes." The reception was held at Jake's ranch. Their ranch now, Clara reminded herself, still getting used to the idea. Tables had been set up in the yard, loaded with food that half the town had contributed. Music drifted from somewhere, a fiddle and guitar playing old songs that had been sung at frontier weddings for generations. Clara moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and well wishes from people who had once treated her like a pariah. Some of them apologized. Mrs. Henderson, with tears in her eyes, the blacksmith with his hat in his hands, even Mrs. Adelaide from the old mercantile, her face tight with shame. "I was wrong about you," Mrs. Adelaide said stiffly, as if the words cost her something. "We all were." "You were afraid," Clara replied, surprised to find that she meant it. "Blackwood made everyone afraid. That's how men like him keep their power. Still, we should have been braver." Clara thought about the years of whispers and turned backs about the loneliness that had nearly broken her. She could hold on to that anger forever, let it poison every relationship she tried to build in this town. Or she could let it go. "You're being brave now," she said. "That counts for something." Mrs. Adelaide's eyes widened, as if she'd expected, maybe even wanted, condemnation instead of grace. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Probably not." Clara smiled, taking the sting out of the words. "But I'm giving it anyway. Life's too short for grudges." She walked away before the older woman could respond, leaving behind another piece of the weight she'd carried for 3 years. Jake found her near the corral, watching the horses move through the afternoon light. "You okay?" "Better than okay." Clara leaned against him, feeling his arm wrap around her waist. "I never thought I'd be happy again. Not like this. Not after everything." "But, no, but, that's the miracle." She turned in his arms, looked up at his weathered face. "I'm just happy. Plain and simple, and terrifying all at once." Jake kissed her forehead. "I know what you mean. Spent so many years expecting the worst that I don't quite know what to do with the best. Figure it out together. That's the plan." They stood there as the sun began to sink toward the western hills, the sounds of celebration drifting around them like music. Clara thought about everything that had led to this moment, the loss and the fear and the stubborn refusal to give up. The promise a dying man had made to his partner, the patience of a guardian who had watched from the shadows, the courage of a widow who had faced down an empire with nothing but truth and determination. "Mama, Pa—" Eli's voice cut through her reverie. The boy was running toward them, his face alight with excitement, something clutched in his small hands. "What is it, partner?" Jake asked. Eli held up his drawing tablet, open to a fresh page. The picture showed a house, not Jake's ranch house, but something new, something that looked like it had been built from imagination rather than memory. In front of the house stood 3 figures, and around them gathered a crowd of other figures, all connected by lines that might have been hands held together. "It's us," Eli explained, pointing to each figure in turn. "And that's Miss Maria, and Mr. Henry, and Running Deer's people, and all the folks from town." He looked up at them with those serious 2 old eyes. "It's our family now, the whole thing." Clara felt her heart swell until she thought it might burst. "That's beautiful, sweetheart." "I know." Eli said it without arrogance, simply stating a fact he had discovered about the world. "I figured something out, Mama." "What's that?" "The town people weren't mean because they're bad. They were mean because they were scared. And scared people do dumb things." He closed the tablet carefully. "But now they're not scared anymore. So maybe they won't be dumb anymore either." Jake laughed, a genuine full-bodied laugh that Clara had rarely heard from him. "Son, you've got more wisdom in your 7 years than most folks find in 70. "I know," Eli said again. "Mama says I got it from Daddy." Clara's throat tightened, but she smiled through the tears. "You did, baby. You got the best parts of him." Eli nodded, apparently satisfied. Then he looked between his mother and his new father with an expression of profound contentment. "I'm glad we're not broken anymore." The words hit Clara like a revelation. She looked at Jake, saw the same recognition in his eyes. They had been broken, all 3 of them, shattered by loss and guilt and loneliness into pieces that seemed impossible to fit back together. But here they were. Not the same as before. You couldn't go back, couldn't undo the scars that life left behind. But whole in a new way. Complete in a pattern they hadn't known was possible until they found each other. "We're not broken," Clara agreed, pulling her son into a hug that included Jake too. "We're different, and different is okay." "Different is good," Jake added. "Different means we chose this. It wasn't just handed to us." Eli wiggled free of their embrace with the restless energy of childhood. "Can I go show my picture to Miss Maria?" "Go ahead, partner." They watched him run off, his tablet clutched against his chest, his laughter echoing across the ranch yard. "He's going to be all right," Jake said quietly. "Yes." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "We all are." The party continued until well past dark, until the last guests had said their goodbyes, and the last songs had faded into silence. Clara stood with Jake on the porch of their home watching stars emerge one by one in the vast Texas sky. Tomorrow she would start learning the rhythms of ranch life. Tomorrow she would begin building the future that had seemed impossible just months ago. Tomorrow there would be 1,000 small challenges and victories and ordinary moments that made up a life. But tonight she allowed herself to simply be grateful. For the man beside her, who had kept a promise made to a dying friend and found something greater in the keeping. For the son sleeping peacefully inside, no longer haunted by silence and loss. For the community that had finally learned to see her as she truly was, not a curse but a survivor. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For everything. For watching over us when we didn't know we needed watching. For standing up when it would have been easier to stand aside. For loving us when we were still too broken to love ourselves." Jake turned her to face him, his gray eyes soft in the starlight. "Clara, I spent 5 years trying to earn forgiveness for things I did in the Apache Wars. Terrible things. Things that would make most decent people run the other direction. I know, you told me. What I didn't tell you is that watching over you and Eli, that's what finally made me feel like maybe I deserved to keep living. You didn't just save yourself from Blackwood. You saved me from myself." Clara reached up and touched his face, feeling the roughness of stubble beneath her palm. "Then I'd say we're even." "More than even." Jake pulled her close and she felt his heartbeat steady and strong against her chest. "We're home." Home. The word settled into Clara's heart like a key finding its lock. For 3 years, she had been homeless in more ways than one, without shelter, without community, without any place where she truly belonged. Now she had all of those things. And she had something more, a family forged not by blood, but by choice, by survival, by the stubborn refusal to let grief and fear have the final word. The Texas wind whispered through the yard, carrying with it the scent of sage and horses and new beginnings. Clara closed her eyes and breathed it in this air that tasted like freedom. Vernon Blackwood was rotting in a territorial prison. The families he had destroyed were rebuilding their lives. Running Deer's people had their sacred land back. Henry Coldwell had found his way to sobriety and purpose. And Clara Sutton Callahan, widow survivor fighter, had found something she'd thought was lost forever. Hope. Not the fragile hope of desperate circumstances, but the solid, enduring hope of someone who had walked through fire and come out the other side. The hope of someone who knew that bad things happened to good people, but also knew that good things could happen too, if you were brave enough to let them. "What are you thinking about?" Jake murmured against her hair. "The future." "What about it?" Clara smiled, feeling the expression stretch muscles that had almost forgotten how. "I'm thinking it's going to be good." And standing there under the vast Texas sky, held safe in the arms of a man who had proven that promises could be kept and second chances were real, Clara knew with absolute certainty that it would be. Because she had learned the greatest lesson that life could teach, that curses were just stories frightened people told, that strength came from getting up one more time than you fell down, and that love, real love, the kind that survived loss and distance and years of silent watching, was worth every risk it demanded. The widow had found her home. The cowboy had kept his promise. And the boy who hadn't spoken for 2 years was finally laughing again. Some stories end with tragedy. Others end with triumph. But the best ones, Clara thought as she turned to go inside with her husband, end with something rarer and more precious than either. They end with family.